Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. On July 18, 1970, the New York Times reported U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. The following year, the Washington Post reported, U.S. scientists sees new ice age coming. The world could be as little as 50 or 60 years away from a disastrous new ice age, a leading atmospheric scientist predicts. Dr. Rasool of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and Columbia University says that. The following year, in 1972, 42 top American and European investigators met at Brown University and then sent this letter to President Nixon. They said, the present rate of the cooling seems fast enough to bring glacial temperatures in about a century. It's been almost exactly 50 years since they wrote this letter, which would mean we're halfway to the new ice age. This was more conservative than NASA's prediction, who said we might be in a new ice age by the year 2021. In 1974, the National Center for Atmospheric Research published this graph, showing dramatic cooling after the 1940s, and they showed that 1870 was warmer than 1970. On March 1, 1975, Science News published this cover, The Ice Age Cometh, and they showed glaciers plowing through downtown Manhattan. In that article, they published this graph from the National Academy of Sciences, which showed 0.7 degrees Celsius cooling since 1938 in the Northern Hemisphere. In 1978, the New York Times said, International team of specialists finds no end in sight to 30-year cooling trend in Northern Hemisphere. And in 1979, the Age newspaper wrote this article, Preparing the World for a New Ice Age. The World Meteorological Office has cleverly chosen one of Europe's chillier years to hold a major conference on the climate, now in progress in Geneva. Drought, floods, the failure of monsoons, and the run of hard winters are all evidence, they say, that the world has come to the end of a spell of even-tempered weather, which began in about 1910 and lasted until about 1960. This period has even been called a little tropical age by one of the more quotable of climatologists, Professor Reed Bryson. What follows the tropical age could be harder to live with, whether more typical of the 19th century or even of the Little Ice Age, which lasted between 1430 and 1850. In November 1976, National Geographic published this graph showing the Little Tropical Age. They showed that temperatures peaked in 1938 and then cooled dramatically until 1976. Downtrend of temperatures since 1938 has come nearly halfway back to the chill of the Little Ice Age 300 years ago. And they showed that temperatures in 1976 were no warmer than they were in 1880. But this warm period from the 1920s through the 1950s has since disappeared from official government temperature graphs. NASA has since erased the cooling from 1938 until 1976. In 1976, there was dramatic cooling from 1938 to 1976, but NASA has erased that cooling and turned it into warming. By altering the temperature data, NASA has turned cooling into warming. The Little Tropical Age in the subsequent global cooling has disappeared. This ClimateGate email from 2009 is very instructive. The world's top climate scientists said it would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but they didn't have any explanation for why they were doing it. Let's look at the 1976 National Geographic graph once again. The graph showed a very cold period in the 1880s after the eruption of Krakatoa. The dust the volcano flung into the stratosphere circled the Earth and cooled global climate for several years. In the year 2000, NASA showed this cool period in the 1880s as well. NASA showed that the warmest year prior to 1980 was 1878, and they showed no net warming from the 1870s into the 1970s. But since then, NASA has changed their data. They erased the warmth of 1878 and began their graph during the cold period after the eruption of Krakatoa. So now they can show a warming trend, which doesn't actually exist. In 1989, the longtime head of climate analysis at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration said this: "Analysis of warming since 1881 shows most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the more recent sharp rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. While global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979, Tom Carl said. We can see this in the National Geographic graph. Earth cooled from 1921 into the 1970s. But NASA has since erased that cooling and turned it into warming. In 1998, there were two competing temperature graphs presented to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. One was Michael Mann's hockey stick, which erased the little tropical age and the subsequent global cooling. That graph has been used by the U.S. government to attempt to show a correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide. However, it does not correlate with what the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration was saying in 1989. Tom Carl said that most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the more recent sharp rise in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. In other words, Michael Mann's hockey stick graph is not an accurate representation of Earth's climate. But it was chosen by the United Nations because it was a much more compelling image of man-made climate change. Now let's look at the temperature graph which should have been used by the United Nations, Keith Briffa's temperature reconstruction. It showed very clearly the little tropical age and subsequent dramatic cooling of the Earth. There was never any doubt that the little tropical age was real. In 1939, it was reported that all the glaciers in eastern Greenland were rapidly melting. It may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers of Greenland, like those in Norway, faced the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. In 1952, it was reported that the glaciers of Norway and Alaska were only half the size they were 50 years earlier. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration shows that hot days in the United States were much more common from the 1920s through the 1950s than they have been in recent years. In 1922, a radical change in climatic conditions was reported in the Arctic with unheard of high temperatures. Great masses of ice have been replaced by moraines of earth and stones, while at many points well-known glaciers have disappeared entirely. In 1923, Glacier National Park was melting so quickly that experts predicted the glaciers would be gone in another 25 years. National Geographic showed the rapid retreat of glaciers in the Alps during the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. Glaciers in Norway rapidly retreated during the 1930s and 1940s. At Spitsbergen, the temperature warmed 18 degrees between 1910 and 1954. And the warmth of the little tropical age wasn't just in the northern hemisphere. In 1948, this was reported. A remarkable thinning out of the polar ice cap in the Antarctic is reported by the Norwegian expedition, which found bare stretches of Earth on an island thickly covered with ice only 20 years ago. So let's take a look at what Michael Mann did with his fraudulent hockey stick graph. He erased the global cooling after 1940. This was known as hiding the decline. And he replaced it with NASA's wildly fraudulent temperature graph of the 20th century. This graph shows in red Briffa's temperature reconstruction, and it shows in blue approximately what was used in the hockey stick. By erasing the cooling after 1938 and shifting temperatures upward, Michael Mann was able to erase the little tropical age. Josh the cartoonist explains Mike's nature trick to hide the decline. It's worth pausing the video and reading through this. Michael Mann's hockey stick reconstruction was chosen by the IPCC over Briffa's temperature reconstruction. Not because the hockey stick graph was accurate, but rather because it confirmed the consensus viewpoint which the IPCC wanted to show. Briffa said there was pressure to present a nice tidy story of apparent unprecedented warming in 1,000 years or more. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on the worst science ever done for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Toki and Upla on the web at realclimatescience.com.